Hello, my name is Jennifer Ibrahim, and I am the Associate Director of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation's National Program Office for Public Health Law Research. The purpose of this presentation, Creating a Public Health Law Database, is to provide you with a general overview of how to create an empirical database of public health laws. In the following slides, I'll offer an overview of the basic steps and some special considerations as you move from laws written in text to laws recorded in your database. I also highly recommend that you be sure to include a statistician on your research team who can help you think through. In a previous presentation called Building a Public Health Law Research Proposal Using the Scientific Method, which is available on our website, I provided an overview of how to put together a methodologically rigorous research proposal. So we talked about developing research questions, conducting your background research, thinking about the theory that underlies your research questions, developing your hypotheses, and designing the study itself. In this presentation, I want to focus on moving to the next step of selecting measures and collecting the data. We'll discuss how to move from constructs to the specific measures that you'll be using, and I'll focus on the process of selecting those measures, defining your values, creating a codebook and the data collection protocol, and collecting and recording the raw data itself. A key point to keep in mind when creating your database is this is absolutely an iterative process. For the purpose of illustration, I have it laid out here as 8 simple steps, but what you'll find is it's a learning process, and you'll move back and forth between these 8 steps as you work on defining your variables and collecting the data. So you have your theoretical constructs in mind, and you need to start thinking about the potential measures that will operationalize each of those constructs. Once you've selected your measures, it's important for you to go to the source of data where the laws have been recorded and see if those measures are actually available. It's good that you've used a conceptual model to define your measures, but those measures may not actually be collected. If the measures are available, your next step is to record the laws and to determine the names and values for each variable. It's important to think about this in advance because this will be your roadmap to documenting each of the data points that you collect from each of the laws. It's important that you also create a codebook and a protocol. The codebook is essentially your dictionary for the data, where you'll go through and define each variable name, and it'll lay out the different values, so the definitions for the variable. The protocol is where you document the process by which you collected the data. And initially, at this stage, I have it here listed as stage 4. Your protocol is an initial draft. It will be revised as you go through and collect the data, but this is your initial pass. At this point, you'll go through and collect your research and record the raw data. It's important that you periodically check for quality to make sure that there's no systematic or human errors that are coming into play as you're recording the data. It's important for you to think about if there's any new variables that you want to create or variables that you missed in your first pass. Once you've finalized the data that you're collecting and you're settled on the variables, the definitions, the values, etc., it's important for you to go back and review your codebook and your protocol to make sure that any modifications have been included in the final draft of both the codebook and the protocol. Now I want to go through and talk about each of these steps in greater depth, and I'll be using a developing cell phone law database that we're creating here at the M.P.H to illustrate the points. When you're developing your measures, you need to think about the type of data that you're going to be using. If you're simply recording whether or not a state has a statute, or if the statute does or does not have a specific provision, then you're using a simple yes or no or dichotomous variable where there's only 2 values. It exists or doesn't exist. While this is easy to collect, it's often quite limiting because it really doesn't describe the true nature of the law beyond the fact that it exists or not. You may also use a dichotomous variable when you're trying to record the existence of specific provisions of the law. So again, yes or no, does it exist? Or you may be looking for data that's categorical. So the law could contain different types of restrictions. So for example, in the cell phone database that we were building, we were looking at restrictions, whether they were using restrictions on telephone or texting, whether the behavior was banned by the law, or if it requires hands-free devices. The data that you're collecting could also be ordinal, where there are different levels rather than just categories. So, are you considering the type of offense? When creating your legal database, there are certainly some challenges to deal with when trying to measure law. In addition to thinking about the level and the source of the data, it's also important to consider differences in jurisdiction and the impact of the law. If there's laws regarding a behavior at the local, state, or federal level, is there preemption which would trump the lower jurisdiction's law? That's important for you to keep in mind. You'll also want to capture the timing of the law, and this may include the date that the law was enacted or the date that the law actually went into effect, so when they started to enforce it. The timing of the law can also raise questions such as anticipation effects from the public based on media or education campaigns that enforcement of this law is coming. There may even be a lag effect where the law is in place, but there's not complete awareness, or that enforcement of the law is actually delayed for a period of time. So you may see an increase in the effect of the law over time as knowledge and compliance increase, or a decay in the law, or the effect of the law, because it's been in place for some time and enforcement and compliance decays. So you may hypothesize that a complete ban on cell phones while driving in a city would result in change in behavior for the first month, as drivers are concerned with getting caught and being fined, but over time drivers recognize that they can get away with it and the effect of the law diminishes. You also need to carefully examine the language of the law for provisions such as sunset clauses, which would place the law into effect for a period of time, and then the law expires on a certain date unless revisited by the legislative body that created the law. Now I want to provide you with a practical example of what I've laid out in the previous slides. Here at the MPO, we wanted to conduct a research study looking at the health impact of cell phone laws. So our basic research question being, can a cell phone restriction while driving lead to an actual decrease in automobile-related injuries and fatalities? This is a project that I've been working on with our legal fellow, Mr. Evan Anderson. The first step for us was to find out if there was an existing database of cell phone laws. And while there are some reports and web-based tools, there was not a comprehensive listing of cell phone laws. So our next step was to turn to LexisNexis and Westlaw to search. So getting started on the search, we began our search with laws related to distracted driving and mobile devices using, as I said, LexisNexis and Westlaw. There were also a number of publicly available websites, which I'll say more about in just a moment, but we began searching these sources using a variety of terms, including mobile, telephone, and cell. In LexisNexis and Westlaw, we also used the wildcard function, the exclamation point, as a way for us to search variations of the word cell, text, motor, and oper, or part of operation. This is so that the search would find variations of these words. And we also use the W/20 option, which searches for cell or text within 20 words of the terms drive, motor, and operation. So it's important for you to be familiar with how to use LexisNexis and Westlaw and the search terminology so that you can put in appropriate terms and variations and to be able to use that wildcard function. We use this search operation, and I'll give you one example, to search in the state of North Carolina, and it returned 643 entries. And as you can imagine, many of these entries were references to things like textual. We also found biological applications such as cellulose, biological term cell. And the restriction within 20 words of drive, motor, and oper didn't appear to narrow our search results anymore. As we looked through the entries returned from these initial searches, we were able to refine our approach and think of additional terms or modifications that would hopefully turn up hits that were more appropriate. The next step was for us to refine our search terms. So in the course of that initial research, we realized that terms such as cellular telephone was commonly used in the place of cell phone in older statutes. So based on several initial searches, we decided on several search terms that seemed to provide much more useful returns. So we used mobile telephone or cell phone or cellular telephone. And again, using the North Carolina example, we found 89 entries in the state that were very easy to scan. And once we went through these, we found the three relevant laws that are listed here. What we did then was to systematically repeat this same search process across the state statutes and regulations for each and every state. In situations where our preliminary search for a specific state yielded no applicable laws, we then turned to Google and contacted state administrative bodies to determine if there were in fact laws that we should be looking at. In our secondary search, we yielded additional laws. We located them on LexisNexis or Westlaw. So if an administrative body said, yes, in fact, there is this law available, we would go back and look that up in LexisNexis and Westlaw. We would also look to see what additional terminology we may need to reincorporate into our search protocol. So for example, in California, we knew that a law had been passed restricting cell phone use by drivers who were 18 years old or younger, but we didn't find it in our initial searches. So we later learned that the relevant statute regulated wireless telephones as opposed to cell or cellular telephones. So we subsequently went back, added this to our search terms, and as we added additional terms, we went back to use the full range of terms for each state to ensure that we had captured all the relevant laws. So again, it is an iterative process. As we learned new terms, we would collect all those new terms and then go back and apply that search protocol to every single state. So here's an example of the law as we found it in our searches on Westlaw. And in this case, it's an example of the searches we conducted in California. So once you have the text, the next step is to move from text to numbers and go through the coding process. To help you set up your database, it's good to think through a few examples of the laws and how you would code them. So for example, what characteristics of the law would you look at? Would you look at timing, scope, enforcement? Such considerations as, are you looking for the period when the law was enacted or when it actually went into effect? Also think about things like the nature of the law, what does it actually say, to whom does it apply? So in the case of our cell phone database, we wanted to know if there was a complete ban or if there were just restrictions, and who did this apply to? Was it applying to all cellular devices? Was it applying to PDAs or more generally any mobile devices? Was the law for the general public or were there special populations being impacted? So some states particularly carve out for particular populations. And as these questions arose, we made a first review of the laws, thought about all these additional questions that came up, and that helped inform the coding process. So as we noted in one of the first slides, when you're developing your database, you absolutely have to think about it as an iterative process where you go through, you learn, and you go back and revise. It's important that you're familiar with your data before you make your final decisions because you don't necessarily know all the characteristics when you first make your initial pass. As I pointed out earlier, things such as existing reports or tables or online reports of laws can be certainly very helpful, but I add the caution that you take it for what it's worth. In the case of Westlaw and LexisNexis, it's producing 50 state surveys of whatever types of laws you're searching for. However, some data such as what you see here may be limited in scope. So for example, maybe it's not capturing all the elements of the law, but when it's recorded this way, it may give the perception that this is a comprehensive evaluation of these laws. There are a range of different groups we found looking at cell phone laws that report on these different things, advocacy organizations, or what you see here is database from the Governor's Highway Safety Association. They can be useful, but again, you don't know the complete search protocol. It's not being provided here, so you can't go through and think through the process that was used and be able to confirm that it was a comprehensive search of the laws. So you need to be concerned about the reliability of the results, and in this case, because you don't have the protocol, you can't assess the reliability. In addition, it's possible that the data sources are incomplete. So for example, while this chart lists all of the state laws governing mobile device use while driving, there's no information on when the laws were enacted or first implemented. In the case of a longitudinal study, this is definitely a problem. So while it may take a little bit more time, in the end, going back and mining the data from the laws themselves will actually provide a more thorough and accurate picture of the laws that you're researching. As I mentioned earlier, going through and documenting your protocol is just as important as collecting the data. you'll want to create a protocol which documents how you went about creating your database in a step-by-step fashion. It should provide a level of detail that guides your collection of the laws and would basically provide a blueprint or a roadmap for another researcher to take the protocol and duplicate the research based only on your protocol. So things that you should include: the source of information, so where you were getting the data on the laws, including specific texts or websites, or the key search words that you were using in an electronic search engine. You need to document the initial data collection process. So in the case of searching laws, it's good to print hard copies of the data for re-examination at a later time. Once you have the laws, how do you start to organize them? So it's important that you document the way that you organized all of the raw data that you were collecting. You need to also document how you record the data. So the coding scheme is important, but it's also necessary to think about the data entry process, including who's doing it, in what fashion, and when they're doing it. So your protocol should outline the plan for monitoring data entry. So do you have one person recording all the data, or do you have multiple people recording the data? How are you going to check for quality to ensure that there's no errors in recording the laws? There should be a process for monitoring the data entry to be sure that there are no errors in recording the data, whether it's a one-time error, human error because someone's tired in recording, or if it's a systematic error in the way the data is being recorded. One way to do this is to conduct a random check of 10 to 15% of the data to just look and see what errors are coming up. Another good way to catch these errors is to run basic descriptives or graphs of the data and just use visual inspection for outliers that may actually be erroneous data points. So once you plot the data, look at it to see if anything stands out. It's not to say that there couldn't be some outliers in the data that are legitimate, but it's a good way for you to visually catch if there were any errors that were happening in the recording process. And lastly, you need to think about a process for data management. So once you put it all together and you make the data available for use, how are you going to go about doing that? Are you going to have text files which could be imported into statistical analysis software, or will you have data files for SAS, SPSS, data, etc.? It's important for you to consider your protocol as your handbook for conducting the research, and as I said, a roadmap for someone to go through and duplicate your study. So what we show here is a snapshot of the first section of our cell phone, the protocol for our cell phone database, and it provides a step-by-step process by which we actually went through and conducted the research. So as you can see, we state that our goal is to compile a database of state-level distracted driving laws from the time period of January 1st, 1980 to March 1st, 2010. Then we go through the primary data collection process, so we indicate that we had 2 students collecting the data. We go through and talk about the sources for collecting the data, the search terms that were used, etc. So it's important that you lay out exactly the way you collect the data before you even start thinking about how you're going to code the data or go through and start recording the data. As I said, this is just the first section of it. The protocol goes on to explain the coding process, how we were working to ensure quality through double data entry, and as I said, 10 to 15% random checks of the data, the cleaning process, etc. Think of this as your way to communicate your research process to demonstrate the quality, but also for someone to be able to replicate what you've done. So in addition to the protocol, which goes through and explains the process by which the data was collected, a second necessary element of a successful database is the code book. You can think of this as the recipe book by which you indicate each of the ingredients in your database. It describes how you name and record each attribute of the law. It's best to go through and gather an initial pass or collection of laws and test out your coding to see what works and what needs to go back and be refined. As you begin to record the attributes of the law, you want to have a final code book in hand to be certain that your coding process is as systematic as possible. So you'd go through, you'd make your first pass, think about your initial thought process for coding, make modification based on your review of the data, and then when you go through to code all 50 states in this example, you want to make sure that you have your final code book in hand so that every single state is being coded the exact same way. If during the coding process you modify something, it's important to go back to the very beginning and make sure everything is coded that same way. So some of your basic considerations when doing this include the name of each variable, the label, the type of data, and the range of values that could be recorded. So if you're going through and constructing a 50 states database, there's going to be some challenges that you're going to face. One thing in this example of the cell phone database was thinking about how we label states. So a common way to name a state is to use FIPS codes, which are Federal Information Processing Standard codes. These are standard numbers assigned to each state. So if you were going to try to merge this cell phone database with another external database, it's important that you can match state by state. Using these FIPS codes is a systematic way to do that. So this is just one example of a challenge that you may face as you're putting together your database. In addition to the name of the variable, you also want to have a clear label or definition of the variable. When you're talking about laws in our cell phone database, I'll use this one example here. The variable we named for the existence of any law regulating mobile communications, we named it any mobile com, but the full label or the complete description of that variable was law regulating mobile communications while driving. So the next thing to record is the type of data. So as noted earlier, is it dichotomous, is it categorical, is it continuous? And lastly, you need to think about the specific values. So using our example here, you can see that this is a dichotomous variable where the value for no is 0 and the value for yes is 1. It's also important to think about missing data, which we have coded here as 9, and unclear or don't know coding, which is listed here as a value of 8. The 8 value was not actually used here, so there were no states where we had a don't know, but the convention for creating the database was used to include this as a potential value for all of our variables. Ultimately, you would hope that you could go through every single state and have a definitive answer and not have any don't know variables. So here's an example of the coding schemes from our cell phone database. You can see that the first column lists the name of each variable, the next column lists the type of data, the label for each variable, and the values, and if there were any data missing. When we created our data set, we were using SPSS, which allows you to go through and enter all of the values in this tabular format. As you can see in this abbreviated snapshot, this is just a screenshot of our database. We went through the laws to draw out all of the attributes, including the type of the law, the special populations impacted, if the enforcement was primary or secondary, fines associated with the law, etc. It's best to be thorough and collect any and all information on all the aspects of the law the first time around, rather than being selective and then having to go back, start your process all over if you missed something. So if you think there's a potential for attributes that you might want to look at later on, it's better to collect it in your first pass. Once you've created the variable names, labels, and values, your next step is to put this all together into a code book, your final code book, which reflects any modifications that you've made throughout the coding process. Most statistical programs have a function within that program where you can generate a code book which lists all of your variables and associated information. So you can think of the code book, as I said, your recipe book that lists all your ingredients to conduct the analysis. So as you can see here, in each box we have the variable name listed at the top, the label in the next line, and each of the values beneath it. In the columns to the right, you see the count of the cases, or here it's the number of states where the particular variable value, as well as the percentage of all cases in the study are listed. Now it's time to go through and record the raw data. So while you've already done some testing of different values and types of variables in the initial passive states, now is when you'll go through and record the data with your final coding scheme. So this should be the first steps at your final version of your database. There's a number of different ways that you can go through and record your data. Here we're using a simple Excel spreadsheet which has all the variable names across the top row. Each of the rows underneath represents an individual state law. So you can see that there are a few lines where there are some states, so California for example, that has multiple entries. And the reason we did it this way is because there were multiple iterations of the law, so each of the rows you see here actually represents one iteration of the law as opposed to just the state itself. You'll also see for the ease of data entry, we left state abbreviations in the database. So rather than trying to remember what the FIPS codes were, we left the state name in here, and when we merged it into our statistical analysis package, we just cleaved off that column A. It's important that you're systematic and methodological when entering the data to attempt to minimize any potential errors that could come up, whether it's human error one time or there's a systematic error in your recording if there was a mistake in the code book. So one way to check for entry errors is through a process called double data entry, where all the data is actually entered twice and then compared for inconsistencies. Particularly when you're using a large database, as I said, human error, fatigue can cause errors. So it's really not a good idea to try to code everything all at once. It's better to break it down into chunks than to try to plow through all at once. The benefit of using a program such as Excel is that the individuals who are doing the data entry don't need the statistical software on their computers to enter the data. In addition, using Excel actually facilitates the sharing of data with anyone. So once you have this database, if somebody else wanted to look at it and they're not using the same statistical analysis software that you have, you could simply provide this Excel database, which could be imported into other programs. At the National Program Office, we're sensitive to trying to share the data as much as possible. We want to create publicly available data sets and encourage researchers to use those, update them, and then share them once again with the next generation of researchers. So the next step, once you have all of your raw data recorded in the Excel spreadsheet, we then moved on to import the data into our statistical software package. So here we're using SPSS, but SAS and Stata will follow similar procedures. To move from Excel to SPSS, we saved our Excel sheet as a tab delimited file. We went into SPSS, used the import function to pull the data in, but this isn't something to be too bogged down about. Again, it's important that you have a statistician on your research team, and the statistician should be the one who could go through and help you to import this data. We've walked through the entire process, but there's a few additional considerations and notes that I want to share with you. Once the raw data is in your software package, that's when you can start to analyze the data, including such things as creating new variables or deriving different measures. So for example, you may have an individual dichotomous variable that indicates several different restrictions within the law, but you may choose to go back and create a categorical variable that combines all of these aspects. So that would actually minimize the number of different variables you have, still being able to capture all of that information, but in one variable that's categorical as opposed to a number of dichotomous variables. Once you've created any of these new variables, it's good to go back and review your codebook one more time. You should also review your protocol for data collection and be sure that there were no modifications before you pack up the data and say that this is finally ready to be shared with the public. It's a good idea to get someone who didn't perform the data collection to use your protocol and try to enter a few lines of data to make sure it's clear. So somebody who has not been involved, who isn't going to be biased by the repetition of doing it over and over, just to see if the way you documented the process makes sense. With the creation of your public health law database, now you're ready to merge it with other databases, such as looking at health outcomes, to really start to answer your research questions and trying to make the link between law and the impact on health outcomes. One final comment that I want to emphasize is the use or misuse of legal databases that may be available on the web. There are a wide range of databases available in many different formats, but there are some databases that will be ready to use with data sets and codebooks. These are reliable, but then there's a whole variety of reports which provide text and status of laws, but they're not converted to numbers, and there's no documented protocol to explain how they went about collecting the information. These sources are used generally to inform the public and may not be as thorough and rigorous as what you'd like for the purposes of research. So it's important not to rely on these as your primary source of data. It's okay to use them as a means to check your data, but don't use this as the final source of your information. I'd like to thank you for your time in reviewing this presentation. I hope that you found it useful and that you're excited and you feel prepared to do your own data collection and prepare your own public health law database. For more information on research methods for public health law research, please be sure to check out our website at www.publichealthlawresearch.org. We'll be producing new methods resources such as working papers and presentations, and we will routinely be posting those up on our website. Thank you.